Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Me RIT webinar, part of a series created exclusively for RIT alumni. I'm Lydia Palmer, Senior Director of Marketing and Communications in the Division of Development and Alumni Relations, and I'm your moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin, let's take a moment to ensure that everyone is ready and familiar with the presentation tools. We're happy to tell you that RIT's Me RIT webinar series has transitioned to a new webinar platform, and we want to be sure that you understand some of the changes in your webinar window. We also want to say at the outset that this is our first webinar on this new platform. So if you find that there are problems or even have trouble navigating the platform window, please do mark that in the chat box and we will be happy to try to assist you. All participants in today's webinar have joined in mute mode and cannot be heard during the presentation. However, we encourage participation. To submit your questions at any time, please enter them in the chat box. The chat box can be opened by clicking on the chat tab at the top of the Livestorm window. We will make every effort to address all your comments and questions throughout the webinar. You are joining today's webinar using broadcast audio. If for any reason you wish to dial in by phone, please click on the Help button next to the chat box. The Help button has a speech bubble with a question mark inside. Click on the third option to view the phone number to call and get the access code. Live captioning is also being provided during this webinar, and you can find the link to access that in the chat box as well. Note that today's webinar will be recorded and made available, complete with captions, within a week following today's event. All participants will receive an email with the link to the recording. If you have any technical questions, please feel free to type those into the chat box as well, and we will do our best to get you the appropriate answers. And with that, let's get started. Today's webinar is Quality Assurance Tools You Can Use Now, Survey Techniques for Lean Six Sigma Projects. Our return guest presenter is Margi Ochs, Director of Marketing and Business Development in the John D. Hromi Center for Quality and Applied Statistics here at RIT. Margi is a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt and holds a BA degree from Georgetown University and an MBA from the University of Rochester. She teaches Lean Six Sigma courses and assists students in applying and implementing their studies through consultation, assessments, and workshops to deepen their knowledge and experience. She joined the center after teaching marketing and organizational leadership courses at both the Simon School of Management at the University of Rochester and the Saunders School of Business at Rochester Institute of Technology. Margi trained as a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt at Xerox, where she led over 60 projects in the areas of marketing, product development, strategic planning, customer service, and manufacturing, totaling over $350 million in revenue generation and cost savings. After completion of her in-program training, Margi carried her Lean Six Sigma experience into a variety of positions, including Worldwide Vice President, Office Products Launch, Consumables Marketing and Strategy, and Competitive Consumables Market Development. She served as a Lean Six Sigma loan executive, consulting with over 80 Xerox customers on Lean Six Sigma implementation in their organizations, and led external projects to solve business problems in areas as diverse as supply chain optimization, medical lean process improvement, and product design and launch optimization. She also has extensive experience mentoring other executives who were first-time project sponsors and working with cross-functional teams dealing with formation and strategic integration of Lean Six Sigma into business and organizational planning. Margi has spoken at a number of conferences and events on the incorporation of Lean Six Sigma into strategic planning. Margi, we are happy to have you back with us today, and our audience is all yours.
Thank you, Lydia. I am delighted to be here and to spend a little bit of your lunch hour talking about how to create a powerful survey. This presentation really came about due to some coursework that I do within my RIT Saunders teaching. And we talk about how to create surveys because they are so important for really getting voice of the customer in anything you do. That is really obvious. Last time we spoke about value stream mapping, and Greg Parley and I have had a great time putting together some value stream maps that we'll be talking to you about in the future. But once you've looked at your process or you've looked at your products, you want to know what your users or your customers think, and you want to know how to create a survey that's going to get you the answers that you need. You may love the answers, you may not like the answers, but you want to get that feedback. So today we will be talking about how to tell if a process is working from a survey. We'll talk about how people feel in relation to your product or service. We'll talk about how changes might have impacted your process, your product, and we'll talk about the difference between opinions and perceptions people have versus some facts that you can gather about a specific offering, an event, or an activity. So with that said, we'll go to our next slide. And oops, I'm sorry, I over-advanced. There we go. And we will talk about when is a survey your best tool to use? What other options do you have? Where do you get started? How do you construct a good survey to meet objectives that you have? How do you ensure that you find the right participants? And what are the pitfalls to stay away from? So with those as our topics, we will start off talking about how to get survey participants. Now, you want to set an objective for your survey. You want to be very diligent, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but you want to be very diligent about understanding what are the objectives of your survey, because you and perhaps your team have a set of objectives that you want to learn more about. But as you talk to other stakeholders, other people in your organization, maybe even customers or other participants, you will find everyone has an opinion. So let's talk about how to get those survey participants. Now, the first decision you have to make is, will this survey be something that you're going to do with people that will be physically present, or will these be people who are in your mailing list, in your database? If for some reason they're captive in the seat, for example, we'll talk about a recent experience we had with a hospital about 200 miles away from RIT, and they were taking a survey of people who were waiting in their waiting room. And we'll talk about how that's a little bit different from going out to your mailing list. But if you do want to go out and do your survey online, which is certainly very popular now, then you might need to get to a new database. You might rent or borrow names, or you might use the open base that you already have. And so you'll just put it out there and see who's interested. So you can either go to your existing mailing list, you can rent or borrow a mailing list, or you can put it out on a social media platform to see who is interested. Now, just a piece of advice that I always tell my students, and we always tell our clients, and this is probably one of the hot buttons that we face, and that is someone always wants to turn the survey into a marketing tactic. So if we're going to ask, hard to believe, if we're going to ask how you liked that pancake I just made for you, you also are going to want to talk about all the benefits and all the great things about that pancake I just served you. And then it turns into a marketing tactic, and it sort of biases the answers that you truly want to get. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that is just something to keep in mind when you're looking at how to get survey participants. Now, you also want to look at response rates. Our clients think that because this is a survey, they should be getting 95% participation in the survey. But if you are using an email survey, click-through responses are about 3%, regardless of the industry segment that you're in. People who are in a room, a waiting room, a classroom, a conference room, obviously their response rate will be much higher, but we have to consider that they fear being found out. So if you have people in a conference room and you're taking a survey, you're giving a survey, you will find that people will be reticent about giving you complete, honest responses because they fear you're sort of walking around and seeing what they have to say, or that immediately after they turn the survey in written form, you are going to be looking at their responses as they're walking out the room. So they have a bias toward giving you positive answers. So open surveys where you use social media, we find has much less respondent bias. We find that using email from your own database or your rented database can be very effective. But remember that your response rate is going to be about 3% or less. So if you want to have statistical significance, you need to think about how many people you need to email to in order to get a good level of response to your survey. Now, one other consideration is something that we find our clients and our students are constantly discussing is, should you give a small incentive to participate? So this could be a giveaway, it could be a drawing, it could be information. We'll give you a white paper, we'll give you some information if you participate in the survey. We've worked with clients who literally are giving away trips. Now, most organizations don't use that tactic. They don't have that kind of budget, but people will talk about doing some kind of giveaway or drawing in order to incent participation. The caution we have there is to beware of something that in psychology we call cognitive dissonance. If you are giving me something for the survey, I'm going to want to participate, and that is great. But you don't want to give away something that has such high value that it will sway your participants, your respondents, to give you positive responses versus giving you their honest feedback. So just something for you to consider. So let's talk about whether you really need to do a survey. So we've talked about how to get your audience. And usually at this point in the process, people are saying, okay, this is a lot to think about. Do I really want to do a survey, or would a focus group work? Would interviews work? So surveys are great when you have a large group and you want to make sure that you are getting a very, very high level of participation. And obviously we've talked about how you control that. And you know that you don't need to do follow-up probes to your questions. So if a person says, I just ate your cereal and I didn't like it, and they score it as no, you might put a question in the survey, but then again, you might not. So know that with a survey, you have a very limited attention span time and you can't do a lot of follow-up. But surveys are very beneficial, and you can even use segmented questions to get people to give you more feedback based on their responses. Surveys are useful if you want to do a pretest, see what opinions are, obviously see what perceptions are, and then you can look at the responses and you can decide you want to go deeper, perhaps into a focus group or interviews. We also tell you not to use open-ended questions because you really need a conversation for those types of questions. So if you're in a focus group, you can say to people, how did you like this process? How did you like this product? But if you're on a survey, just asking them yes or no will give you an opinion, but it won't maybe give you the information you want related to why. So we find that surveys can either be very useful when you want to get a large number of respondents, or is a great introduction to focus group work when you want to do a temperature check and you see if people really feel a certain way, so you can probe deeper and get into a focus group with them for more information.
Margie, we have a question. How many people do you need to reach out to have a valid survey?
That is an excellent question. And the answer to that has to do with, first of all, do you want to get a statistically significant population? If you're going for statistical significance, then we're going to ask you how confident you want to be. So we're coming into that season where we're going to see a lot of presidential polling. And in the presidential polls, they will talk about plus or minus 5%. They know the precision they want to get when they do the survey that asks, who would you vote for president? So we would need to know what level of significance that you want to get to. And then we could help you or direct you to simple formulas that will tell you how large a population you need to reach out to, and then how many respondents do you have to get to be statistically significant. So unfortunately, I can't just tell you sort of as a base rule of thumb, but I can tell you that it is relatively easy to figure out, if you want to go for statistical significance, how many people you would need in the population, how many people you would need as respondents, and then what level of significance would you be at? Plus or minus 10%, plus or minus 5%, or even tighter. Now, finishing the answer to that question, you might just want to know trends. You might just want to do a simple survey to get it out there and see what opinions people have, so that you can see if it seems like you have a challenge to deal with or not. In that case, we would tell you, okay, don't worry so much about statistical significance. You won't have that. But if we can get a survey that is at least 5 to 10% of your eligible audience, we have enough information, if the audience is big enough, to tell you what trends you have. It won't be statistically significant, but it will tell you that you have a trend going on that you might want to investigate further. So the question is really statistical significance or trend.
And the follow-up to that is it correct that there is a point at which simply getting more respondents doesn't really change your result?
Exactly. You know the script that I'm on, because we're going to talk about that. That's great. So oftentimes we will say to people, let's get this survey out in the field about your process or your product or whatever the topic is. And I have to be honest. They will say, we're not sure we're getting the response the answers that we thought. So we want to keep surveying more people. Obviously, that is sort of a process failure that we have to admit. We want you to get to the maximum number of participants that you can using the tools that you have, but just holding the survey open to get more and more responses to try and change the answer isn't going to get you what you want. You want honesty, and getting more respondents or begging for more respondents isn't going to change the answers that they're giving you in a measurable way. So you clearly want people to put together surveys that are based on the objectives that you have. So if you want to know if people like your product, are happy with your process, are happy with the changes you've made to something, then you need to know your survey objectives. And yes, you probably know me well enough. I would argue that you want to put those into a document, and you want to walk around with that document to everyone you talk to. You want to say, this is what we're trying to find out, and only this. Because when you're asking people in a survey to fill out that survey, odds are you're not going to have them for half an hour. So you need to be very succinct about what your survey objectives are, and you need to make sure that those objectives are measurable. So oftentimes when you see Quinnipiac polls or other polls dealing with presidential elections, they will ask people, who would you vote for if the election were held today? And they will get usually a statistical population, a statistical sample for that. But when they want to know why people would vote for that candidate or not, they may ask a few questions in the poll, but they will revert to using focus groups to truly understand what is forming people's opinion. They want to know what are the relevant issues, what are the hot buttons. And so they are looking for opinions. They are looking again for those trends. We want to make sure that what you're asking for in your survey is really measurable. And we want to make sure that you understand that you can't know it all from one survey. There are going to be questions that you just don't have the time to ask because it will hold the respondent for so long that they'll just either opt out or start clicking answers just to be done with the survey. And we dealt recently with a retailer who came to us because they wanted to use some Lean Six Sigma techniques. And they talked about the survey we were using. And the survey was an online survey. And they said the average time to completion was 9 minutes. And one of their problems was, why are they getting so many non-completes? We said, well, that's very obvious. Would you spend 9 minutes filling out a survey? So you can't know it all from one survey. So you want to test the survey. Go to your stakeholders and ask your stakeholders if they would take the survey, because you want to get their buy-in and you want to make sure that they're comfortable with the survey and feel that it is measuring what your objectives are. But you want to keep your survey time to 3 minutes or less, or even less than that, if you possibly can. Now, once you test the survey with stakeholders in your organization, you are going to get literally hundreds of questions that people want you to add, that people want you to modify, that people want you to change in some way. While you're asking our customer base, could you ask them about this because we need to know that? Don't fall into that trap. Again, you are lucky if you can hold people for 3 minutes or less. And if you tested your instrument and you are going strongly over 3 minutes to 3.5 to 4 minutes, you're in the danger zone. And if you're asking people questions that are ancillary, but not totally on topic for the objectives that you have, psychologically, and I won't take you through all the reasoning behind this, but I'm happy to talk with you offline. Psychologically, you will be impacting the cognitive processes that people are using to answer the survey. And so you're sort of scattering their thoughts rather than focusing them the more you ask questions that are ancillary to what your objectives are. So write down your objectives, know what you want to get from the survey, and don't waver from that, even after you've tested your instrument and people want you to add other questions. So let me give you an example of working out an objective. When you write an objective statement, we worked with a client and we worked up an objective statement that you see here. We start with what do you want to discover? We look at what the purpose is, and we look at who the segment is. Who are you really trying to go after? So in this case, the client said, we want to assess the level of perceived customer satisfaction with our patient login process. And we want to survey those who are between the ages of 30 and 45 who have logged in within the last 2 weeks. Our goal is to understand if changes to our new process need to be considered. So we met with them and we had to really tighten up their objective statement because people were adding to the objective statement and saying, We want to know also how happy people are with our clinic, how happy people are with our practitioners, how happy people are with our chairs. We even had one person who said, we want to know if the colors that we have painted the rooms are calming to the patients. And we said, whoa. Again, you've got a very brief amount of time. You don't want to know what they thought about, let's say, your prior login process. That's old information. And they may or may not have that in mind as they're answering the survey. You don't want to go back in time. You want to know what they think about now. You aren't asking if they like your hours or your location or if the doctor was friendly. Those are all good questions, but you're talking about a patient login process for people who come into the clinic, and instead of being greeted by a receptionist, they use a screen to be logged in. And your clients are between the ages of 30 and 45. If they're 80 and they're not familiar with using the particular process that you have, they're probably going to find it difficult to use a screen to do this. I'm generalizing, but if your patients are 5 or 6, you want their parents to do this. So you want to pre-select from your patient database patients who are within the segment that you have, and you want to make sure that you're staying right on track, because if you ask if the nurse that they saw was competent, that is taking away from the questions you have, which deal with, in this case, the patient login process. So you want to be very specific with your objective, and you want to really hold yourself firm to that objective and not let that enemy we've talked about before, scope creep, come into this. And then you'll be asking them if they like the parking lot and if they like the food in the vending machines. And pretty soon you have a survey that's going on for an hour, and it's taking away from the real question that you had. So you also want to understand if in writing your survey questions, there is any bias. And I can give you all kinds of answers to this where people would say, oh, no, we're not biased, not at all. But when you really looked at their survey, they led their witness, so to speak. They looked for an answer. They omitted answers they didn't want, or they gave their respondents reason to just opt out, to say, I'm going to abandon this because they don't really want my feedback. So if you talk about the brand new way that you just did something and how wonderful it is, you're kind of biasing your respondents to give you positive answers. If you simply want facts about what they think about your new process or your new product or some particular objective that you have, you don't want to lead them. You don't want to force the answer by saying, are you very satisfied or satisfied? And I have seen surveys that ask the question that way, because if you're not satisfied, what do? You say, well, they don't really want to get my answers, and you opt out. Or they will say, well, we don't want this particular answer. We don't want them to be neutral. So we're not going to give them that option. And we'll talk about this in a minute when we talk about Likert scales. But if you omit an answer and you don't give your respondents a chance to answer that way, again, you're giving them more reason to leave the survey, particularly if it's online. So let's talk about the types of questions that you want to consider and where bias might creep in. So one area is using response scales. Response scales would be anything from, say, strongly disagree to strongly agree. But literature shows that you don't want to bundle the questions with the response scale like you see in this little illustration at the top right of the page. Respondents grow very tired with long sets of matrix questions that they have to check off. You're not taking your SATs again. So we absolutely advocate for response scales, but in a minute you'll see we advocate for keeping them separate for each question. One thing to talk about is that nowadays we're a very mobile-oriented organization. And so when you are using your mobile phone, your cell phone, your smartphone, that grid gets pretty small. And we find that users rush, they leave, or they just ignore. This is where we're likely to find respondents just going right down the matrix and giving the same answer. We also advocate use a midpoint or an odd number of responses to make sure that the entire range is covered. But you'll say, well, Margi, I don't want to know if they're neutral. I want them to give me how they feel, positive or not positive. But maybe they're truly neutral. And if they are, they're going to have to make up something to respond because they truly feel neutral. So you want to get to the variance to uncover how people are really thinking. If I just ask you how satisfied you are, satisfied or unsatisfied, it's a binary question. And in that situation, well, all right, I've only got two choices. But if I use the response scale, then I'm getting a little bit more insight into how strongly you feel. So when you ask individual questions with a scale and not just with a matrix that they can easily just go down and check off the same answers, you can be even more precise. And research does show that when you separate the answers into individual matrices by each question, you will get a more thorough consideration of the question. So let's continue on with tips for great questions. We really, really suggest that you don't use too many open-ended questions. Research shows that open-ended questions with room for comments at the end is definitely preferable. Too many comment sections within the survey frustrate respondents, and it causes them to leave before the survey is done. We recently worked with a client and they were taking a survey of people in the room. Great, okay, so you know your respondents, they're all sitting in the room. And the survey that they had written after every question had a box where the respondents could make a comment. What we found was that people were looking around the room to see what other people were doing. The survey was taking too long. And rather than writing into the boxes, they tended to default to the same answer because those comment boxes were frustrating them. So leave the comment box at the end, or don't use too many, because if you do, you will get into that fatigue that we talk about. We also say, don't ask many binary questions. Now, this is obvious: agree, disagree, yes, no, true, false. But we find that a lot of organizations do use binary questions because they're quick and they think that it'll get people through their survey and get them to respond. So they'll put a web survey out. Do you agree or disagree that using straws is still the right way to drink a beverage? Agree, disagree. You don't know what people are really thinking when they respond to a question about using straws. So you can get a quick response, but you really want to know a little bit more. And that's why we think that scales are a much better way to go. Now, you can use a nested bridge question, and I'll talk about this, but sometimes that can cause early departure. So if you say, do you use straws? You first of all got the bias that now there's a lot of press that says, plastic is harmful to sea turtles. I better not say yes, I'm just going to say no. So you're not really getting the answers that you're looking for. But you might have a question that says, if you use a straw, Please answer the questions below. And then you can ask people why they use straws. Maybe they have a medical reason. Maybe they use a metal straw or a paper straw. But if you just ask yes or no, do you use straws, you might not get any part of the answer you're really looking for. So they're quick, but they're not always effective.
Margie, we have a question. How many questions in a survey is too many? What is there a fall off rate for questions, for survey questions to survey completion?
That is a great question. So if you need to keep your survey below 3 minutes, and 3 minutes doesn't seem like it's that long, but it can be an eternity. The first thing you have to do is pre-test the number of questions that you have to really see if people can make it through in 3 minutes or less. We generally advocate that if you're asking somewhere between 10 and 15 questions, you're starting to approach the point where people are going to get into fatigue. So we generally say, go back to your objectives, and we'll talk about this. Scrub your questions hard, because once you get over 10 questions, people tend to feel very, very fatigued. So we'll come back to this, but it's a great question. And that's why pre-testing is important, because people will say, oh, I want the survey to be 2 minutes. And in that 2 minutes, I think they can do a question every 5 seconds. You want them to think, you just don't want them to answer. So keeping those questions to somewhere around 10 to 15, we think is about as long as you can really go. So we strongly advise clients, begin with the end in mind. Think about what you could do with the responses. Consider any data that would be missing that would prevent you from taking action. So think about your objectives, what your goal is. If you want to find out how people think about the login process that you're using for your orthopedic clinic, then you want to think about what you will do with the responses, and you will gauge your questions in that manner. So if for some reason you want to know if the screen was big enough, perhaps you want to think about whether or not you would change the size of the tablet or the monitor that people logged in using. So consider any data that might be missing and prevent you from taking action. So that's where, if you say, and what do you think about your nurse? It takes away from the real point, the real objective of the survey. Be sure the answers provided help you make the decision about what to do. And sometimes we have situations where we're dealing with clients and the questions they want to ask simply just aren't going to get them where they need to be. And if that's the case, then we say, you might need to do a focus group, because you really want to probe. And a survey is so quick, it's not going to get you to the point that you need to make a decision. One other point, make sure that you use your respondents' language so they understand and don't misinterpret. Don't use a lot of technical jargon. Don't use a lot of abbreviations that you haven't explained. You think it's obvious, but it might not be. You might have respondents whose first language isn't English, so they don't understand some of the colloquialisms that we use. Just make sure you're using the respondent's language. And don't try to get every question that you have answered in this survey, or people just won't answer the instrument. What I mean by that is, if you do have 25 questions, it is likely people are just not going to use the instrument. Now, one question we frequently get asked is, if we're using an online survey technique, should we just show one question at a time? That way people don't know that they're getting 25 questions. And we say, well, you can certainly do that, but once you get, we find, around 10 to 15 questions, people tend to get fatigued, they'll bail out, or they'll just start clicking on an answer because they're done with it and they just want to get to the end. So you may have more questions, things that you really want to understand. You want to know if people like the color of your waiting room, but don't use this survey to get that because it doesn't tie to your objectives. So we want to, let me just try and move forward here. Okay. So what information will be most useful to you in your survey? How do you answer that question? Well, go back to those objectives you wrote and be rigorous about the core information you really need to have versus what would be nice to get. Everyone is going to come to you with their favorite questions and tell you what you should be asking. But you really need to police yourself about your objectives for the survey and the core information that you need. You want to test to ensure that there's a reason for every question that ties directly to your survey objectives. For those of you who might have or might be working at Xerox, I'll just use a war story, but we used to do employee satisfaction surveys and we would ask people what they thought about their benefits. Every year that question would be asked. Every year employees would respond, but it really didn't help to find out if they liked or didn't like their benefits because they basically understood from employee feedback how people felt about the benefits. So leave that question off because your objectives might be something else. And if there's not a reason for a question, then don't ask it. So balance your information needs with the real estate of your service, of whoever is providing the template, whether you're doing it or you're using an online source such as SurveyMonkey. Because if your information needs are too long, you can't get those responses anyway. People will abandon the survey. So the more people that see that draft of the survey, they're going to buy in, but they're going to give you more questions. Because now in the electronic age, we can all be editors. We can all be inputters. So early on, you might want to ask people about objectives. You definitely want to test your survey. But the more people you talk to, the more questions people want to ask on your instrument. And another rule of thumb, if you can't take any action from the data you collect, be sure you really need to ask for it. So if you ask the question, how would you rate the government's immigration process? And let's say you're the president of the United States, there might be some relevancy. But if you are asking that question and you might be asking about this because you're an immigration lawyer, is it really important how they would rate the government's immigration process because your clients need to utilize your services anyway? So if you sort of already know the answer, or you can't take an action from the data you collect, like the benefits question, then don't ask it. Make sure that the questions that you're asking are the questions that you can really take action on. And again, try it out and see if you get what you really want. Use your colleagues to pre-test your survey and then put it out to a sample of your database or a group of people that you can put in your conference room and provide the survey and see how it's being viewed by respondents who mirror the people you want to reach. Don't tell the test base that they're just simply testers, but you can ask for their feedback later. What did you think about this survey? Did you understand that question? Is there something else that would have helped us to really zero in? Ask them if there's any questions with jargon or language or terms that wouldn't be understood. And certainly check to make sure that you're not assaulting someone's intelligence. Let me explain to you how a tablet works. Let me explain to you what a yellow light looks like. Believe it or not, we have seen some of these on surveys, and when they insult someone's intelligence, they take time, and people don't like to deal with that. So test the survey, see if everybody understood the nomenclature that you used, see if they stayed with the survey and didn't abandon it. Make sure that they understood your language, make sure they understood your terms, and make sure they didn't feel that the survey was overly simplistic or somewhat insulting to something that they might already know. So test that survey, take it for a test drive. You don't have to do it with a huge population. Maybe you just test it with 10 respondents, and then you can go back and ask them questions about the survey and what they really thought. Then you're at the point where you can give the survey and you can collect and analyze the data. And again, this comes back to, did you want survey accuracy or did you just want a pulse? Did you just want an opinion? Do you think that there's any bias in your survey that you need to absolutely comb out of your survey as you develop the final questions? Are you using a package such as SurveyMonkey that will help you tabulate and display the results? And if you are using a package like that, is the data fully exportable? Can you take it into Excel or Minitab so that when you collect and analyze the data, you have the ability to do more advanced statistics on it if you so choose, or that you have the ability to display it easily in presentations and feedback? In your survey, did you promise to return any findings to survey participants? If you did, then you need to consider how you are going to provide that result, that answer to your survey participants. Once we complete the survey, we will be providing the data at this particular website, or we will be mailing the results out to you. That kind of takes away from anonymity, but still the survey can be anonymous and the respondents be collected separately, their emails. But make sure that if you do say, we'll give you responses, you make sure that you live up to that. And then, did the survey give you something that was quite shocking, quite different from what you expected? And if it did, and you require more insight, do you need to run another survey from a population that might already be a little bit tired? Or do you need to maybe now turn to focus groups or interviews to get more information that you're looking for? So now you're at a point where you have maybe gotten your data, and perhaps you want to share the data with, in some way, shape, or form, with the population that you asked to respond to your survey. So some pieces of advice. Don't claim statistical significance if you don't have it. If this was just a trend or an opinion survey, that's fine, but do take the trend seriously. Use these trends to maybe do a deeper dive with a new survey and show that you act on good data. We dealt with a company that does a lot of surveys to hospitals. You probably know them by name. Their surveys are very long, they're very involved, very nested. But the number one problem we found when we worked with them on their process was that people would take the time to respond to these long, arduous surveys, and then nothing would change. And so over time, respondents were saying, I'm not going to bother to tell you what I thought about my last appointment or my experience in your institution, because nothing changes. So show that you act on good data, and you'll keep your respondents coming back. Now, we need to talk about what could go wrong, because sometimes things do happen. Maybe your respondents use a smartphone, but your instrument, your survey, is optimized for PC only. You need to think about that. What happens if the server goes down? If you're using someone like SurveyMonkey or any of the other services that are out there, they have redundancy. But if you are using your own survey, your own instrument, be careful that you have the IT infrastructure to support that, because if your server is down, they won't come back. What could go wrong could be that they hate your offering and you've given them an open survey and they get all their friends to tell you that. That is a famous story that happened to United Airlines. They put out an open survey on their website and social media, and people use that survey to pound them about how they treat animals on their planes. So be very careful about that. Maybe that was a worthwhile input for United to get, but there probably were other ways to get more insightful information. Be careful that your survey isn't too long and it causes abandon. Make sure that your language is not confusing. So it could go wrong if you're using confusing language with double negatives and jargon that your respondents don't understand. One point is, if you ask for demographics at the beginning of your survey, we find that can create a little anxiety. I don't ask for your name, but if I ask for too much information, what's your gender, what's your age, what's your title, what office do you work in, it's going to be pretty easy to identify who you are. And then you don't want to ask too many open-ended questions that tire the respondent, because if you're like the client I discussed at the beginning of the webinar, you're going to get to the point where respondents say, I'm just not going to type all this in, I'm done. So, should you be anonymous? That's a question we get asked all the time. So many times you're going to get truer answers if you get people to stay anonymous, but you can always give them the option to provide their names and contact information, but don't require it or probe for it. Just give them the option at the end. If they want to give you their name and email address or their location, their phone number, you can ask for it, but they're not required. If you're providing an incentive, try to separate the incentive from the survey so that you give them a code or something else that they can use to collect whatever incentive you're giving. But if they have to give you their email to get the incentive, then they worry that anonymity might be compromised. Yes, people who are just pleasers, but they have issues, are more likely to remain anonymous. They don't want to hurt your feelings. They don't want to upset you. They like to please you. They're yes people. So if you want to get truer feedback, we find, and the research indicates, that anonymity is the way to go. But if they have an issue and they raise it, they might want follow-up. So make sure that if you think there are going to be big issues with your process or your product, that you're giving people an optional space to contact you, to write their question, to get more dialogue with you electronically or live because they have an issue. Then, as we wrap up, let's talk about the top 10 things that I hope you found useful today. Write your objectives. Be rigorous about your real estate. Make sure that every question is really necessary. If you're going over 10 questions, you're getting into the danger zone. If you're getting to 15, you are definitely there. Do a test survey. Make sure you're using your respondents' language. Keep your survey short and simple. Ask direct questions that they can answer, and use a Likert survey or some sort of scale. Ask one question at a time. Make sure that your respondents aren't trying to read ahead and then they're trying to think ahead of time about how they should be answering the question that you have. Just ask one question, get the response, and move on. Avoid asking leading or biased questions. Avoid using grids or matrices for responses where you have a bunch of questions next to that grid. Again, go back and ask each question separately with the matrix so that your respondents can respond to that without just going down and checking every box. Don't use binary questions, and yes or no, agree or disagree. And then Reflect appropriate findings. If you've promised to give feedback, give the feedback. Now, we can definitely help you. We're happy to answer any questions. As always, you're welcome to call me. We are happy to talk to you about surveys that you're doing, or if you're nearby, we actually have a course on survey design, and you can see the description of the course. It's going to be held August 12th and 13th right here on campus at the Hugh Carey building, and I'm happy to say that you get a 20% discount. What will we be doing in this class? You'll be talking about survey planning, you'll be talking about analytics, you'll be talking about the difference between opinion polling and satisfaction surveys, and surveys that might have to do with product, service, and design. And then we'll be talking about different data collection methods that we couldn't talk about in this seminar. So if you have interest in this, the web link is right here. And if you want to talk to me live about it, I'm just a phone call or an email away. So if you do need to talk more, here's the information that you can use to contact me, our website, my email, and my office phone number right here at RIT. And I would love to talk to you further because I really appreciate your time in dialing into this. So next, we'll be going into the future webinar.
We have one question, and we will remind everyone we do have a couple more minutes, just a few more minutes, if you do have questions for Margie. One question that we have is, is there a response rate that is higher based on the different types of surveys, i.e. paper versus email, online versus an actual phone spoken survey?
Sure. So if you use a paper survey and you're handing it out to people and you're asking them to stay and provide the answers to the survey, you can get nearly a 100% response rate. The question there is jargon, nomenclature, all of those things. If you're using an online survey, your response rates will be much lower. Research says there is a bit of a response bias, that you're likely to hear more from people who are dissatisfied than satisfied, but maybe that's what you're looking for. If you're doing a phone survey, you're not going to get every single person you phone to want to be a respondent, but you probably are going to get a much higher response rate than if you leave it to people to just do an online survey, where we find response rates are down around 3%, as I said earlier. So if you want to guarantee response rates, try to do it in person. Try to do it by phone, although it can be sometimes hard to get people by phone. And then if you want to get a very large survey, do it online. Your response rate won't be that high, but you have a much higher population to pick from.
Terrific, thank you. We have two questions that I'm actually going to answer for you. We've had a few people ask about the recording, about recordings for past Margi Ochs webinars, and the copy of the slides. And all of those are available to you. We will email a link to the recording, and we will include a copy of Margie's slides for this webinar. Past webinar recordings are available at rit.edu/merit. I'm checking to make sure I have that URL right. So those are available as well. A few of you actually asked for them, and we will email you those links. Okay. The second question that we got from two individuals, Evan and Catherine, is what other Six Sigma classes are available? I'm sure Margie's glad to hear that question.
Absolutely.
If you take a look at her slide right now, there is a website to the Lean Six Sigma coursework and training environment. If you visit that, I'm sure you will find a listing. Please also feel free to email or call Margie, and she's happy to talk to you about it. Okay?
Certainly.
So with that, that is the our time for today. You can, as I said, email additional questions to Margie, or send them to ritalum@rit.edu, or tweet them to @rit_alumni, with the hashtag #MeRITWebinars, and we will direct your questions to Margie. As I mentioned, you will all receive an email from us within the next week with a link to today's webinar recordings. We thank you, Margie, as always, for taking the time out to be with us today. Please do join us next Tuesday, June 25th, for our #MeRIT webinar, doing a comprehensive college search, insider tips and recommendations. And that is presented by Ian Mortimer, RIT's Vice President of Enrollment Management. Thank you again for joining us today. Please exit the webinar by closing your LiveStorm window. And please let us know what you thought of the webinar through an under 3-minute survey that you will receive via an email. Have a great day.